A homeless widow stood in tears until twin boys whispered something that would change everything. Papa needs you too. But this is not a story about simple kindness. This is a story about secrets buried under a prairie sky, about a town that watches with 1,000 eyes, and about a woman who thought she had nothing left to lose right before she was handed a lie that could cost her everything. The wind in Willow Ford had teeth. It bit at Clara's shawl, a raw, cold welcome to a town that had already decided she didn't belong. She stood on the church steps, a ghost in plain sight, clutching a small clay jar. Inside was the only thing she owned in this world, a sourdough starter, a living thing she'd kept breathing through hunger, through loss, through being cast out by her own kin. 50 years had taught Clara how to be silent, how to endure. She'd endured a husband who dealt cards better than he loved, endured in-laws who called her a burden the second the dirt hit his coffin. But being cast out, truly alone, was a different kind of cold. The whispers of the townsfolk were just another part of the wind. Too old, too heavy for her age. She won't last the winter here. Each word was a stone in her pocket, weighing her down. She tried to hide her face, but the tears came anyway, hot on her frozen cheeks. That's when she felt the tug. 2 boys. Identical, with freckled noses and eyes the color of a clear river. One held out a tin cup. Steam rose from it, carrying the smell of warm broth. "Ma'am," he said, his voice too steady for a boy his age, "you look cold." She tried to refuse. Pity was a bitter meal, but the second boy pushed the cup into her numb hands. "Papa says nobody should stand hungry on church steps." The warmth seeped into her skin, a kindness so sharp it hurt. Then came the whisper, the one that stopped the world from turning. The first boy leaned in, his breath a small cloud in the air. "Papa needs you too." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A strange, impossible truth. Clara stared at them, the cup trembling in her hands. Who was their papa? And why would he need a woman the world had thrown away? Before she could ask, they were gone, their laughter fading as they ran down the dusty road leading out of town. She was left alone on the steps, holding a warm cup and a cold, terrifying question. For the first time in years, it wasn't shame she felt. It was a hook pulling her forward, a whisper promising a home. Or maybe, just maybe, a trap. The road out of Willow Ford was a muddy scar on the land. Clara clutched her satchel, the clay jar of starter safe inside, and followed the memory of 2 small boys. She had no destination, no plan, just an echo in her head. "Papa needs you." After a mile, the world opened up. A river curved through a green valley, and on a low hill stood a ranch house. Smoke curled from the chimney like a beckoning finger. A simple wooden sign read, "Riverbend." The boys were already there, pushing open the front door. "Papa, we brought her." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She stopped at the gate, expecting some hard-faced rancher to come storming out. Instead, the man who appeared on the porch was quiet. His hair was graying at the temples, his shoulders were broad but stooped with a weariness she recognized, and his eyes were kind. Too kind. He looked at her, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "I know you," he said, his voice soft. And suddenly the world tilted. Clara knew him too. Years ago. A flood. A relief kitchen in another town. A hollow-eyed man had come in, clutching 2 toddlers. She'd served him soup. She'd pressed a warm loaf of bread into his hands, bread she'd baked herself from this very same starter. She remembered how he'd looked at her, not with pity, but with a silent, desperate gratitude. "You gave me back my wife's scarf that day," he said now, "on this porch, under this sky. I never forgot." The forgotten kindness hit her like a physical blow. A small act, a forgotten moment had somehow survived all these years and led her here. "I am Thomas," he said. Clara, she whispered back. The twins, Eli and Evan, tugged at her skirt. See, Papa? She came. Thomas looked from them to her, and his next words were careful, measured. They've missed a mother's hand, and I've missed company. Would you stay the night? Just till you find your feet? Shame, hot and familiar, rose in her throat. A widow staying at a widower's ranch. The town would have a field day. But the boys' hopeful faces undid her. I can cook, she said, her voice barely audible. To pay my keep, he shook his head. No debt here, just bread, if you're willing. She tightened her grip on the jar of starter, the one thing she had to give. But as she stepped over the threshold, a cold thought slithered into her mind. It was all too perfect. A forgotten memory, a ready-made family, a lonely widower. What if this wasn't a kindness? What if it was a calculation? The smell of baking bread was a ghost in that house. It was the scent of home, of family, of everything Clara had lost. Her hands remembered the motions, the familiar rhythm of kneading dough, of coaxing life from flour and water. Eli and Evan watched her, their eyes wide with a hunger that wasn't just for food. When she pulled the golden loaves from the oven, their laughter filled the quiet kitchen. For a few hours, Clara let herself believe. She let herself feel the warmth of the hearth, the weight of a child's hand in hers. She let herself imagine a future that wasn't just about surviving until the next sunrise. But the real world was waiting, just down the road, in Willow Ford. The next morning, she walked to town for supplies, a basket of fresh bread on her arm. The moment she stepped onto the boardwalk, it started. Conversations stopped. Eyes followed her, sharp and hungry. Stayed the night at the widower's place, did she? A woman hissed from the doorway of the general store. Shameless, another clucked, circling like a crow before his wife is even cold in the ground. The words were like wasps, stinging and vicious. Clara wanted to turn and run, to disappear back down that muddy road and keep walking forever. But she didn't. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked straight into the store. She would not let them see her break. That evening, back at Riverbend, the weight of their judgment settled back onto her shoulders. She sat by the fire, her satchel in her lap, her hand resting on the cool clay of the starter jar. It was a lifeline. A way out. I can leave, she thought. Tonight. Disappear before they can tear me down completely. She looked across the room at Thomas. He was mending a harness, his face etched with exhaustion in the firelight. He looked up and caught her eye, and his smile was so full of simple gratitude. It broke her heart. I'll pay you for your work, he said, as if reading her mind. Proper wages. For cooking, for minding the boys. It's not charity, Clara. It's a position. That way no one can say otherwise. Dignity. He was offering her dignity when the whole world offered her shame. It was a powerful anchor. But was it enough to hold her against the coming storm? Later, as she tucked the boys into their beds in the loft, Eli grabbed her hand. You won't leave, will you? He whispered, his eyes dark with a fear that seemed too old for his face. No, she heard herself say. I won't leave. But as she walked back down the ladder, a new, more terrifying thought took hold. The town's hatred felt personal. It was more than just gossip. It was organized. It was pointed. They weren't just judging her for staying with a widower. They were warning her away from him. The nights at Riverbend were different. The silence out here wasn't empty. It was alive with the sound of crickets and the groan of the windmill. But for Clara, it was a silence filled with echoes from town. Shameless. Desperate. A crow. She'd been at the ranch for 3 days, and each day felt like a year. The boys clung to her. Thomas treated her with a quiet respect that was both a comfort and a terror. She sat at the kitchen table late one night, the candle flame dancing, her mind racing. Every instinct told her to run. to pack her satchel and walk until her boots fell apart. Thomas came and stood in the doorway, turning his hat over and over in his hands. "I know what they're saying in town," he said, his voice low. Clara's face burned. "It's nothing I haven't heard before." "Still," he said, stepping into the room, "it ain't right. I should have thought about that before letting the boys bring you here. I wasn't thinking of gossip. I was just thinking they needed—" He trailed off. "That we needed some kindness." He sat across from her, his gaze steady. "You should know the truth, Clara. My wife, Mary. She died 3 winters ago. A fever took her fast. I buried her myself up on the ridge." Clara looked at his hands, calloused and strong. The hands of a man who could dig a grave. "It's just been me and the boys since," he continued, his voice rough with unshed grief. "I tried to keep it all together, but a man can't fill every silence alone." She understood silence. She knew its shape, its weight. But his silence felt different. It felt heavier. "And you think I can fill it?" she whispered, the town's cruel words rushing back. "A woman they laugh at?" "I think you're strong," he said, his voice firm. "And I think my boys know it. The town—" He shook his head slowly. "The town never knew how to measure a soul." His words were a balm, but the fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. What was he not telling her? "I've carried too many names, Thomas," she said, her voice trembling. "Names that weren't mine. I don't know if I can carry another." Just then, a small voice drifted down from the loft, one of the twins, dreaming. "Mama." The word hung in the air between them, a plea, a promise, and a chain. Clara bowed her head, the weight of that single word pressing down on her. The boy wasn't calling for his dead mother. He was calling for her. And she realized with a jolt of ice-cold dread that the boys hadn't just brought her here for comfort. They'd brought her here for protection. But from what? Sunday morning broke bright and clear, but a storm was gathering on the church lawn. Clara walked toward it with the twins' hand in each of hers. Their small fingers gripped her tightly, as if they knew what was coming. The whispers started the second they stepped inside. "There she is. Thomas must be truly desperate." Clara kept her head high, not for herself, but for the 2 small boys flanking her like guards. She would not let them see her falter. After the final Amen, the townsfolk gathered outside, their faces tight with judgment. A woman named Martha Gable, her face sharp as a hawk's, pushed her way to the front. Clara recognized her as the ringleader of the whispers at the general store. "Clara," she said, her smile a thin, cruel line. "You seem to be settling in quite comfortably at Riverbend, in another woman's home." The crowd went silent. All eyes were on Clara. Her throat went dry. Her mind went blank. But before she could speak, Thomas stepped forward. He stood beside her, his presence a solid wall. "She has not settled in, Martha," he said, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable ring of steel. "She has held my family together. She has fed my sons, and she has brought more decency to that house than this town has shown in years." He swept his gaze over the stunned faces. "If any of you saw her worth as clearly as my children do, you'd keep your tongues kinder." A murmur went through the crowd. Martha Gable's face flushed a deep, ugly red. She looked from Thomas to Clara, her eyes burning with a hatred that was far too hot for simple gossip. It was personal. Later, back at the ranch, the tension finally broke. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said, her hands still shaking. "Yes," Thomas replied, his eyes meeting hers across the kitchen table. "I did. You don't have to fight this alone." That night, as she tucked the boys in, Evan whispered, "Don't leave us, Mama Clara." She kissed his forehead. "I won't." But as she lay in her small room, listening to the house settle, a chilling realization dawned on her. Thomas hadn't just been defending her honor. He had been drawing a battle line. And Martha Gable's venom wasn't just about a widow moving in too fast. It was about Mary. Clara had a sickening feeling she hadn't just moved into a widower's home. She had moved into the middle of a war. And she didn't even know what they were fighting about. The days that followed were a strange kind of calm. Thomas worked the ranch, his movements deliberate, his silence deeper than before. The boys stuck close to Clara, their games quieter, their eyes more watchful. It was the calm before the storm, and she knew it. The town of Willow Ford had excommunicated them. When Clara went for supplies, shopkeepers served her with clipped words, their eyes refusing to meet hers. No one spoke to her on the street. She was invisible. She and the family at Riverbend were an island. One evening, after a long, silent supper, Thomas found her on the porch, staring out at the darkening fields. "I need to tell you about Martha," he said, his voice heavy. Clara turned to face him. "She hates me." "No," he said, shaking his head. "She hates me. She just uses you as the weapon." He leaned against the porch rail, his profile stark against the twilight sky. She was Mary's older sister." The piece clicked into place with a sickening thud. This wasn't about a stranger. This was family. "When Mary and I got married," he continued, "Martha was against it. Said I wasn't good enough. Said a dirt-poor rancher couldn't give her sister the life she deserved. After Mary died," he paused, his breath catching, "Martha claimed I was responsible, that I worked her too hard, that the fever was my fault." Clara's heart ached for him. The weight of grief was heavy enough without the added burden of blame. "She wanted to take the boys," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Said I was an unfit father. We went to the magistrate. He sided with me. She's never forgiven me for it. She's been poisoning the town against me ever since." It all made a terrible kind of sense. The whispers, the coordinated shunning. But something was wrong. "Thomas," Clara said slowly, "a fever. It's a tragedy. It's no one's fault. Why would a whole town turn against you for that?" He wouldn't look at her. He just stared out into the darkness, his hands clenched into fists on the wooden railing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and Clara knew with absolute certainty that he was lying. Mary hadn't died of a fever. It was something else, something so bad he couldn't even say it out loud, something the entire town believed he was guilty of. Clara felt like she was living in a house made of glass. She watched Thomas, searching for cracks in his story. She listened to the boys, hoping for a clue in their childish chatter. The lie sat at the dinner table with them each night. It was in the way Thomas's smile never quite reached his eyes. It was in the way the twins would suddenly fall silent, their faces clouded with a memory they couldn't name. She started searching. When Thomas and the boys were out mending fences, she went through the house. She wasn't proud of it, but she was desperate. The feeling of being watched, of impending danger, was growing stronger every day. In the bottom of a heavy cedar chest, beneath a stack of Mary's carefully folded linens, she found it. A small, leather-bound journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The handwriting was neat, feminine. Mary's. The first few entries were mundane. Notes about the garden, the price of feed, a new dress pattern. But as she read on, the tone began to change. October 12th. Thomas was angry again today. He broke a plate. The boys were scared. He said it was just frustration with the drought, but his eyes, they were so cold. October 19th. Martha came to visit. She told me to leave him, to take the boys and come live with her. She says he has a darkness in him. I told her she was wrong. But was I lying to her or to myself? Clara's blood ran cold. She kept reading, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. November 3rd. He was working on the windmill. The big wrench slipped from his hand. It fell 30 feet, landing just inches from where Evan was playing. He swore it was an accident, but he didn't even look down to see if the boy was all right. November 10th. He's been talking about selling the ranch. Says there's a buyer from back east offering a good price, but this land is all we have. It was my father's. I told him I would never sell. The look he gave me, I will never forget it. The last entry was dated 3 days before Mary died. November 21st. I found papers in his desk. He's been corresponding with the buyer. He's planning to sell the ranch out from under me. He knows I won't allow it. I'm so afraid of what he'll do to keep me quiet. I told Martha. She's coming tomorrow. Clara slammed the journal shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It wasn't a fever. It was murder. Martha Gable wasn't a bitter sister-in-law. She was a woman who had tried to save her sister and failed. The kindness in Thomas's eyes wasn't real. It was a mask. And Clara wasn't a guest in his home. She was a replacement, a pawn. And now she was a witness. She had to get the boys out. She had to run. Panic was a wild animal clawing at her throat. She stuffed the journal into her satchel, her mind racing. She had to get to town, to the sheriff, to Martha. She looked out the window. Thomas and the boys were on the far side of the pasture, still working on the fence line. She had time. She scribbled a quick note for the boys. Gone for supplies. Be good. And left it on the kitchen table. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was the best she could do. She all but ran down the long, muddy road to Willow Ford. Every shadow seemed to reach for her. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep behind her. She didn't go to the sheriff. Thomas was respected. She was an outsider, a vagrant. Who would they believe? She went straight to Martha Gable's house, a neat but severe-looking home at the edge of town. She pounded on the door, her knuckles raw. Martha opened it, her face a mask of suspicion. What do you want? I know, Clara gasped, pushing past her into the house. I found her journal, about Thomas, about the ranch. She pulled the leather-bound book from her satchel and thrust it at Martha. For a moment, Martha just stared at it, her face draining of all color. Then she snatched it, her fingers tracing the worn cover, her eyes filled with tears. I told them, she whispered, her voice cracking. I told the sheriff he was a monster, but they wouldn't listen. They called me a hysterical, grieving sister. They said he was a good man. He's not, Clara said, her voice shaking. We have to get the boys. It's not that simple, Martha said, her gaze hardening. He has the whole town fooled, and he's clever. When Mary died, he made it look like an accident. Said she fell from the hayloft, a terrible tragedy. A fall from the hayloft, not a fever. Another lie. He'll never let those boys go, Martha continued, pacing the small parlor. They are his claim to this land. Mary's father left the ranch to her, and to her children. As long as Thomas has the boys, he controls Riverbend. The cold, calculated truth of it settled in Clara's stomach like a stone. This wasn't about loneliness or needing a mother's hand. It was about an inheritance. What do we do? Clara asked, her brief surge of courage draining away, replaced by a deep, chilling fear. Martha stopped pacing. She looked at Clara, her eyes narrowed. He brought you there for a reason. You're his alibi. The kind, matronly woman who helps the poor widower. No one would suspect a man like that. You make him look innocent. The horror of it was dizzying. She wasn't a pawn. She was a shield. He won't let you leave either, Martha said, her voice grim. Now that you know the truth, you're as much a prisoner as they are. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Both women froze. A man stepped into the parlor. He was tall, dressed in black, with a face that was somehow both handsome and cruel. It was the town reverend, Mr. Davies. I believe, he said, his voice smooth as oil, that this conversation is over. and behind him, holding a shotgun, stood the Willow Ford sheriff. The trap slammed shut. Clara stared at the sheriff, then at the Reverend, her mind struggling to make sense of it. "Martha," the sheriff said, his voice laced with a weary disappointment. "Stirring up trouble again, and roping this poor woman into your fantasies." "It's not a fantasy," Martha shrieked, holding up the journal. "It's right here, Mary's own words." Reverend Davies glided forward and plucked the journal from her hands as if taking candy from a child. He didn't even open it. "Grief does strange things to the mind," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "We all know how much you loved your sister, but you cannot keep slandering a good man like Thomas." "He's not a good man," Clara cried out, finding her voice. "He lied about how she died. He's trying to steal the ranch." The sheriff sighed and shook his head. "Ma'am, Thomas came to me right after you left the ranch, said he was worried about you, said you'd been acting erratically since you arrived, talking nonsense. He was concerned Martha here might be putting ideas in your head." It was a lie, a perfect airtight lie. Thomas had anticipated her every move. He hadn't been on the far side of the pasture by accident. He had been watching her leave. "He's a monster," Martha whispered, tears streaming down her face. "And you're helping him." "That's enough," the Reverend said sharply. He turned his cold eyes on Clara. "You have been living under Thomas's roof, accepting his charity. In return, you conspire with this unstable woman to ruin his name. You should be ashamed." The sheriff gestured with his shotgun toward the door. "I'm taking you both down to my office to cool off, and I'm sending a deputy out to Riverbend to make sure Thomas and the boys are all right." Clara's blood turned to ice. A deputy. Alone with Thomas. He would twist the story, paint her as a madwoman, a danger to the children. By the time the sheriff let them go, it would be too late. Thomas would have made sure her word meant nothing to anyone. She was trapped. They both were. As the sheriff herded them out the door, Martha stumbled. Clara reached out to steady her, and in that brief moment, Martha pressed something small and cold into her palm. A key. Martha leaned in, her lips brushing Clara's ear, her whisper so faint it was barely a breath. "The smokehouse. Behind my house. Go." Before Clara could react, the sheriff pulled them apart. No more talk. He marched them down the street, the eyes of the town following their every step. They weren't just gossiping now. They were watching a public shaming. The unstable sister and the crazy vagrant, finally getting what they deserved. But all Clara could think about was the key in her hand, and the word go. She had to create a diversion. She had to get away. It was her only chance. The boys' only chance. The sheriff's office was a small, suffocating room that smelled of stale coffee and dust. He sat them down on a hard wooden bench. "You two are going to sit here and think about the trouble you've caused." He locked the door from the outside. Clara's heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. The key felt impossibly heavy in her pocket. "The smokehouse," she whispered to Martha. "What's in it?" Martha kept her eyes on the barred window, her face a grim mask. "Proof," she said, her voice low. "The one thing the Reverend couldn't find. The one thing Thomas doesn't know exists." Footsteps echoed outside. The sheriff was talking to someone, a deputy. "Go on out to Riverbend," the sheriff was saying. "Just check on 'em." Thomas sounded pretty shaken up on the wire. The deputy's footsteps faded away. Time was running out. "How do I get out of here?" Clara asked, her voice tight with panic. Martha glanced around the small office. Her eyes landed on the pot-bellied stove in the corner, a pile of oil-soaked rags next to it. "You're going to have to be brave," Martha said, her eyes meeting Clara's. "Braver than you've ever been." Clara understood instantly. Fire. It was a crazy, desperate plan, but it was all they had. While Martha created a commotion, shouting and banging on the locked door, Clara moved quickly. She stuffed the oily rags into the stove, her hands shaking so badly she could barely function. She found a match in a small tin on the sheriff's desk. She struck it. The rags caught with a terrifying whoosh. Thick, acrid smoke began to billow out of the stove, filling the small room. "Fire!" Martha screamed, her voice raw with real panic now. "Help! Fire!" The smoke was choking, blinding. Clara dropped to the floor, crawling toward the window, gasping for air. She could hear shouting outside, the sound of the key fumbling in the lock. The door burst open. The sheriff stumbled in, coughing, his face a mess of confusion and anger. In that split second of chaos, Clara saw her chance. She scrambled to her feet and darted past him, out the door and into the street. "Hey, stop!" he yelled after her. But she didn't stop. She ran. She ran like she hadn't run in 30 years, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. She ignored the shouts behind her, the shocked faces of the people on the boardwalk. She ducked into an alley, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She risked a glance back. The sheriff was helping a coughing Martha out of the smoke-filled office. He hadn't followed her. Not yet. She didn't have much time. She found the smokehouse behind Martha's home, a small windowless shed with a heavy padlocked door. The key slid into the lock. It turned. The door creaked open into darkness. The air inside was cold and smelled of cured meat and damp earth. She fumbled for another match, her fingers trembling. The tiny flame flickered to life, pushing back the shadows. And she saw it. It was a wooden chest tucked away under a pile of old burlap sacks. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed newspaper, was a man's coat, a fine woolen coat, far too expensive for a poor rancher like Thomas. Tucked into the pocket was a small silver flask, and stitched into the lining, in neat, careful letters, was a name. Not Thomas's name. It was the name of the man from back east, the man who had been trying to buy the ranch. But that wasn't the shocking part. Beneath the coat was a stack of letters, not from the buyer to Thomas, but from the buyer to Mary. They were love letters. Mary hadn't been afraid of Thomas. She hadn't been his victim. She had been planning to sell the ranch, take the money and her children, and run away with another man. Thomas hadn't killed his wife to get the ranch. He'd killed her to stop her from leaving him. It wasn't greed. It was a crime of passion, a twisted, possessive rage, and the whole town, led by the Reverend, had helped him cover it up. Why? Clara's eyes fell to the bottom of the chest. There was one more thing, a thick ledger book. She opened it. It was a record of loans, dozens of them, small amounts, large amounts, all made from the Willowford Church Benevolence Fund, and every single loan was made out to a citizen of the town. At the bottom of each page was a signature authorizing the loan, Reverend Davies, and next to his a co-signer, the man who controlled the church's finances, Thomas. He hadn't just murdered his wife. He and the Reverend were embezzling from the church, using the money to buy the loyalty of the entire town. That's why they protected him. They weren't just neighbors. They were accomplices. The truth was a weight so heavy it threatened to crush her. Clara stood in the smoky darkness, the ledger in her hands, her mind reeling. This was never about her. It was never about a lonely widower needing help. Riverbend wasn't a home. It was a fortress. And Thomas wasn't just a grieving husband. He was a king, ruling over a town he owned, body and soul. The Reverend wasn't a man of God. He was an accountant, laundering his flock's morality for a few dollars here and there. And the boys, oh, the boys. They weren't just children who missed their mother. They were hostages living in a gilded cage with their mother's killer. Their whisper on the church steps, "Papa needs you," hadn't been an invitation. It had been a warning. They had seen something. They knew, in that way children know, that their father was a monster. They were trying to find an ally, someone strong enough to save them, and they had chosen her. The weight of that trust settled on her shoulders, heavier than any lie. She heard shouting in the distance, the sheriff organizing a search party. She couldn't go back into town. They'd be looking for her. She had to get back to Riverbend. She had to get the boys. She took the ledger and the letters. It was all the proof she had. She left the coat, pushed the chest back under the sacks, and slipped out of the smokehouse, locking the door behind her. She didn't take the road. She cut across the fields, keeping to the low ground, the tall prairie grass hiding her from view. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red. By the time she reached the ridge overlooking the ranch, it was full dark. The house was lit up. She saw the deputy's horse tied to the porch rail. She crept closer, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She peered through the kitchen window. The scene inside was sickeningly domestic. The deputy was at the table, a plate of food in front of him. Thomas was sitting across from him, looking the very picture of a concerned father. And the twins, Eli and Evan, were sitting on the floor by the hearth, their faces pale and still. They weren't playing. They were waiting. Then she saw it. Thomas's hand was resting on the table, innocuous, normal, except for the small, pearl-handled pistol lying next to his plate, almost hidden by a loaf of bread. He was holding the deputy hostage. The deputy didn't even know it yet. He was chatting, laughing, completely unaware of the snake coiled across the table from him. Clara knew she couldn't just burst in. Thomas would kill the deputy without a second thought. He might even kill the boys. She had to get him out of the house. She looked around desperately. Her eyes landed on the barn. It was 50 yards from the house, a dark, looming shape against the starry sky. It was filled with dry hay. An idea sparked in her mind, an idea so reckless, so dangerous it took her breath away. She remembered the matches in her pocket. She had started one fire today to save herself. Now she would start another to save them all. She moved like a shadow, circling around the back of the house, staying low to the ground. The barn door was barred from the outside. She lifted the heavy wooden plank, the sound deafening in the stillness of the night. She slipped inside. The air was thick with the sweet, dusty smell of hay. Moonlight streamed through the cracks in the walls, creating stripes of silver in the darkness. She didn't hesitate. She pulled out the last of her matches and the stack of love letters from the chest. The evidence of Mary's betrayal. It seemed fitting. She lit the corner of a letter. The dry paper caught instantly. She tossed it into the nearest pile of hay. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a small orange snake of fire slithered up a stalk of hay. Then another, and another. The flames grew with a hungry roar, consuming the dry tinder, reaching for the rafters. Smoke, thick and black, began to fill the barn. Clara backed out, pulling the door mostly shut behind her, and ran for the cover of a nearby cluster of willow trees. She didn't have to wait long. Fire! It was the deputy's voice, sharp with alarm. The kitchen door flew open. He ran out onto the porch, followed by Thomas. "The barn!" the deputy yelled, already running toward the blaze. Thomas hesitated for just a second. He glanced back into the house at the boys. He was weighing his options. The ranch, his life's work, was going up in flames. But his hostages were in the house. Greed won. "Boys, stay inside!" he roared, and then he took off after the deputy. This was her chance. Clara sprinted from the trees to the house. She burst through the kitchen door, her heart in her throat. The boys were huddled together, their eyes wide with terror. "Mama Clara!" Evan cried, running to her. "We're leaving," she said, her voice firm. "Right now!" She grabbed their hands. Eli pointed a trembling finger at the table. The pearl-handled pistol was still there. Without thinking, Clara snatched it. It was heavy, cold, and felt utterly alien in her hand. She herded the boys out the back door, away from the fire, away from the shouting men. They scrambled into the darkness, toward the river, toward the only escape route she could think of. Behind them, the barn was a raging inferno, spitting sparks into the night sky like a furious dragon. They could hear Thomas shouting her name. "Clara, you can't hide. I'll find you." His voice was no longer the soft, gentle tone of a grieving widower. It was the raw, guttural howl of a cornered animal. She pushed the boys harder, deeper into the thick brush along the riverbank. She had the boys. She had the proof. But they were alone in the dark, with a killer hunting them. And the fire was not just a distraction. It was a beacon, telling the whole town of Willow Ford exactly where they were. The river was a black, rushing ribbon in the darkness. Clara pushed the boys ahead of her, downstream, stumbling over roots and rocks. The smoke was thick in the air, burning her lungs. "I'm scared," Evan whimpered, his small body trembling. "I know," Clara said, trying to keep her own voice steady. "We just have to be quiet. We have to be brave." She found a small washout under the riverbank, a hollow space hidden by a curtain of tangled willow roots. "In here," she whispered, pushing them gently inside. "Don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." She could see the lights now. Lanterns, an army of them, moving through the fields from town, drawn by the fire. The whole town was coming. But they weren't coming to help. They were coming to protect their king. She watched as Thomas met them at the edge of the field, gesturing wildly, pointing toward the river. He was spinning his story. The crazy widow, the kidnapper, the arsonist. She saw the sheriff. She saw Reverend Davies. She saw all the familiar faces from the church, their expressions grim and determined. They fanned out, their lanterns bobbing in the dark, a closing net. She was trapped. There was nowhere left to run. She clutched the heavy pistol in one hand and the ledger in the other. A twig snapped nearby. She froze. A figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't Thomas. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Martha. Her face was smudged with soot. Her dress was torn, but her eyes were blazing with a fierce, unwavering light. "I knew you'd come for them," she whispered, her gaze finding the boys huddled in the washout. "They have the whole town looking for me," Clara said, her voice shaking. "I know," Martha said, "but not everyone in that town is bought and paid for." She pointed back toward the road. A wagon was waiting in the shadows, its horse already harnessed. "There are still a few of us who remembered what Mary was really like," Martha continued. "A few who never believed the Reverend's lies. We're a small army, Clara, but we're here." Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through Clara's chest, but just as they started to move toward the wagon, a voice cut through the night. "There you are." Thomas. He stood 10 feet away, a silhouette against the raging fire. The deputy's rifle was in his hands. "Give me my boys, Clara," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Clara pushed the twins behind her, shielding them with her own body. She raised the small pistol. It trembled in her hand. "They're not your boys anymore," she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "They're hers." She nodded toward Martha. Thomas laughed, a cold, empty sound. "You think she can protect you? You think anyone can? Look around you. This is my town, my world." The search party was closing in. Their lanterns formed a circle of light around them. "It's over," Thomas said. "Give them to me." "No," a small voice said. It was Eli. He stepped out from behind Clara, his small face pale but resolute. "You hurt Mama," he said, his voice clear and steady. "We saw." Evan stepped out beside him. "You pushed her. In the barn." The world went silent. The circle of lanterns stopped moving. The townsfolk stared, their faces caught between belief and disbelief. Thomas's face contorted with rage. The mask was gone. The monster was finally free. He raised the rifle, aiming it not at Clara, but at his own son. "You will be silent," he snarled. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Thomas's rifle. It was from the small pistol in Clara's hand. She hadn't aimed. She had just pointed and pulled the trigger, a desperate, hopeless prayer. Thomas cried out and staggered back, clutching his shoulder. The rifle clattered to the ground. The spell was broken. The sheriff, his face a mask of horror and dawning comprehension, rushed forward. "Thomas," he choked out, "what have you done?" Reverend Davies started to back away, melting into the shadows, but two stout farmers who had been part of Martha's small army stepped forward and blocked his path. Clara dropped the pistol and sank to her knees, pulling the two shaking boys into her arms. She held them tight, burying her face in their hair, as the world she had stumbled into finally, violently, came apart. The fire at Riverbend burned itself out by dawn, leaving behind the blackened bones of a barn and a legacy of lies. The truth, once uncaged, spread through Willow Ford faster than any flame. The ledger, the letters, the boy's testimony. It was an avalanche that buried Thomas and the Reverend. They discovered the body of the man from the east, Mary's lover, buried in a shallow grave out past the windmill. Thomas had killed him first, then confronted his wife. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a cold-blooded execution. The town, faced with its own reflection in the ashes, was forced to reckon with its cowardice. Some packed up and left in the night, unable to face their neighbors. Others, humbled and ashamed, came to Martha's house, offering apologies that sounded thin and hollow in the morning light. Willow Ford was a broken town, but for the first time in a long time, it was an honest one. Clara stayed with Martha, helping care for the boys. They were quiet, haunted by what they had seen, but in the gentle, steady rhythm of a safe home, they began to heal. They clung to Clara, the woman who had walked into their lives from nowhere and refused to let the monsters win. One day, weeks later, the new magistrate came to see her. He told her that in Mary's will the ranch was left to her children, but a guardian was needed. Martha, he explained, had nominated Clara. "Me," Clara whispered, her heart skipping a beat. "But I'm nobody. I have nothing." "You have them," the magistrate said simply, nodding toward the boys who were watching from the doorway, their eyes full of a fierce and fragile hope. "And they have you. That seems like everything." And so the homeless widow who had arrived in Willow Ford with nothing but a jar of sourdough starter and a pocketful of shame became the mistress of Riverbend. She didn't do it alone. Martha moved in with them, the two women and two boys forming a strange and wonderful new family. They rebuilt the barn. They replanted the garden. They filled the quiet, wounded house with laughter. Clara still baked her bread, the familiar scent a reminder of how far she had come. She had been called too old, too big, too much. She had been called a burden, a crow, a madwoman. But now she had a new name, one the boys had given her a long time ago, Mama. And it was the only one that mattered. This story is a reminder that sometimes the most broken places are where the strongest things are built. It's about the courage it takes not just to survive, but to stand up and fight for those who can't fight for themselves. Clara's journey wasn't easy, but she proves that you are never too old, and it is never too late to find where you belong. We tell stories like this because we believe that even in the darkest of nights, there is always hope for a new dawn, and that the quietest voices can sometimes roar the loudest truths. If this story moved you, please consider hitting that subscribe button and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder of their own strength. And I have to ask you, what do you think was the bravest thing Clara did? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and your voices matter here, and we can't wait to read them.